Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jason Zacher, Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy at the Greenville Chamber. Over the past 2 years, we've hosted these community matters discussions to connect you with local, state, and national leaders on topics of relevance to you and your business. We're pleased today to bring you this special edition of Community Matters regarding the Biden administration's COVID-19 action plan that was announced last week. This plan comes with significant controversy, as has nearly everything else throughout this pandemic. The Chamber did a quick survey of our membership over the last several days. And while certainly not scientific, the findings are instructive and probably reflective of the general sentiment of upstate business. So I'll ask our speaker today to respond in her comments. 82% of the folks who responded disagree or strongly disagree with the action plan. About 72% of the 100 employee firms with 100 plus employees disagree or strongly disagree, and 92% of the folks with less than 100 employees disagree or strongly disagree with the action plan. I would say one of the less inflammatory comments that we received was, I have concerns about a significant loss of employees if this type of mandate is actually implemented. So given the level of concern with this action plan, we're pleased to bring you today's webinar. All attendees should be on mute with their cameras turned off, and you can please submit questions through the chat feature. We'll moderate them and get them to our speaker when she's finished with her presentation. So today we're pleased to have with us Ashley Cutno, a shareholder with Ogletree Deacons. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, Ashley has led Ogletree Deacons' nationwide unemployment response team. In this role, Ashley tracks unemployment changes nationwide and provides counsel to clients on unemployment-related issues. In addition, Ashley is the co-chair of the Ogletree COVID-19 Litigation Practice Group. And COVID-19 litigation involves all areas of employment law, as well as personal injury related claims. In this role, Ashley's been able to utilize her substantial litigation experience that includes employment litigation, personal injury litigation, medical malpractice defense, and complex toxic tort defense. Outside of COVID-19, Ashley concentrated her practice on management side employment litigation, including defending rights against wage and hour discrimination, wrongful discharge, and breach of contract claims. She also has a broader general litigation practice that has allowed her to defend clients in complex toxic tort actions, class actions, asbestos personal injury defense, construction defect cases, and FELA claims on railroad clients. Her specialty is complex litigation, class actions, and multi-plaintiff litigation. So if we're going to be talking complex litigation, I think that Biden action plan may count for that for today. In addition to this work, Ashley is very engaged with the Greenville Chamber and currently serving on the Accelerated Leadership Council and providing guidance to the Chamber's Manufacturers Roundtable, among other activities. Ashley, thank you for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you with an update on this action plan.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Obviously, this Biden COVID-19 action plan has really raised a lot of concern in the business community for all of you that have over 100 employees. And so what I'm going to do today is go over the most frequently asked questions that we're getting, give you the basics of what we don't know. I'm also going to tell you some of the things that are not yet clear. So, and then what we think about those different aspects of this plan. So first, it's important for you guys to understand what actually has happened today. So right now, all we have is an announcement from President Biden that an ETS is coming. An ETS is an emergency temporary standard that OSHA has the authority to issue if there is a clear evidence of harm in the workplace. This is a rare thing that happens. This will be the 10th one in the history of OSHA. And the reason they're so rare is that there's no rulemaking that goes along with it. OSHA issues these ETSs, and they are only good for 6 months from the date of issue. After 6 months, OSHA then must go through its regular rulemaking process and either let the rule move into that rulemaking process to become a fully vetted OSHA rule, or the rule will expire after 6 months. But what we have now is an announcement that this ETS is coming. OSHA has said in various seminars that they have had that they think that it will take a couple of weeks for them to get the rule out. We've loosely been told that their goal is 45 days. So we're really looking at kind of the middle of October for this plan to actually become effective. When it is issued, it will be immediately effective. What we don't know is how long they're going to give for the vaccination piece of the ETS. What we expect is going to happen is that when the ETS rolls out, it will immediately require weekly testing of individuals. And if a company decides to go voluntary mandatory, the company could decide to go mandatory vaccination, there will obviously be a time period before that could go into effect because of how quickly people can get vaccinated, and then the 2 weeks following vaccination for people to be fully vaccinated. So again, we think it's going to be a couple of weeks before the ETS comes out. The ETS is going to do one of two things. It is either going to require everyone in a business be vaccinated, or it is going to mandate weekly testing. And it's going to be a choice. What is not clear yet is if it is going to be the employer's choice or the employee's choice. I know in the media, we keep talking about this ETS as a mandatory vaccination ETS, but it is really mandatory vaccination or weekly COVID-19 testing. So again, it will go into effect immediately and be good for 6 months once it does go into effect. One of the other big questions we've had is the ETS going to be applicable to all employers? That answer is basically yes, as long as you have more than 100 employees. We do not know yet if the 100 employees will be by location or by company. That will come out in the final version of the ETS. However, I can tell you that on several OSHA calls that they've been having, it is clear that it is probably going to be by company, not by location. We will be surprised if it is by location based on the commentary that OSHA has been given in several conference calls to business groups that they have had since the ETS came out. So we are anticipating the 100 employees will be counted by location. Other things we are unclear about to date is the impact on employees if they are 100% remote. Normally, OSHA does not deal with employees who are 100% remote. They leave that to something different because they're not in the workplace. However, with this ETS, Biden said it himself, the intent is to cover as many people as possible. So that is one of the pieces that we're going to be closely watching. We're also going to be closely watching, and we've been told that OSHA is evaluating how they're going to treat independent contractors, your temporary workers, and it is probably going to be under that new joint employer standard that the NLRB is looking at, which is the most inclusive of the tests that we can have, but that is something else to watch out for if you're on that 100 employee line. Again, OSHA covers more employers than realize it, right? It also covers not just manufacturing, but your white collar workers and people who normally don't have to deal with OSHA. This is going to impact all of them also. The other piece of this that you need to remember is if you have any kind of contact with government contracting, in addition to the ETS, Biden separately issued an executive order having to do with federal contractors. The big difference with that rule is there is no option for weekly testing. It is mandatory vaccination only without that second tier option. Those rules involving the federal contractor executive order are supposed to drop on September 24th. So we're getting pretty close to that date. One of the things that we've heard is that they're going to look closely at the subcontractors of federal contractors. So if you're in the chain going down from any federal work, you do want to double check the verbiage of the executive order language that's going to come out on the 24th to make sure you're not covered in the federal contractor executive order, because again, the big difference is they do not have the option for weekly testing of employers. So again, when this thing comes out, it'll be immediately effective. Now, in South Carolina, we have our own version of OSHA. We're a state-sponsored plan. So what does that mean here? So it'll be immediately effective in all of those states where they do not have a state plan. In states like South Carolina, the state OSHA will have up to 30 days to adopt the federal OSHA plan. The way state and Fed OSHA works, Fed OSHA is the baseline. So if the state wanted to do something different, it would have to be more than this Fed OSHA ETS, assuming the Fed OSHA ETS stands, right? So you will get a 30-day or some delay in South Carolina for state OSHA to adopt it, but state OSHA does have to adopt any Fed OSHA plan, or they risk losing their state OSHA charter. So South Carolina OSHA has made a statement on this thus far, but basically what they've said is we're waiting and watching to see what the actual ETS says when it comes out. And again, this is one where the devil really is in the details. So here are what I'm going to call the most common questions that we're getting, and they're the ones that I think the most deeply impact all employers. So the first is, let's talk about the mandatory vaccination piece. Question one, who's going to have to pay for the vaccine? And do you have to pay for time off to get the vaccine and or time off if someone has an adverse reaction to the vaccine? So that is not clear in what has been issued yet. However, in the healthcare ETS that was issued related to COVID, employers did have to pay for the vaccine, for time off to get the vaccine, and for time off if someone had an adverse reaction to the vaccine. Because of that, we expect the same rules in this ETS. Now, we all know that there are lots of free places to go get a vaccination, so that's not really impactful to the employers. But we do believe that you will probably have to give people paid time off again to get the vaccine. And, you know, if they feel bad the next day or for a day or two after, that would also be paid time off paid for by the employers. One question we've gotten is what happens if someone has a really bad reaction to the vaccine? So in other states where this has happened, those kinds of vaccinations, when they're mandated by the employer, have been considered to be a workers' compensation industry. We think that that will probably be the same thing here, even though it's coming through a government mandate. If the employer chooses to go this mandatory vaccination route and someone has a really bad reaction to the vaccine, it would be a workers' compensation injury. Also, there is a fund for anyone that has an adverse reaction to a COVID vaccine or any vaccine, because you can't sue the makers of vaccines. There is actually a national fund that pays for that. All right. Now, how about if your company chooses not to mandate the vaccine, but you do decide to go with this paid weekly testing option? The number one question, and what I think is going to be the driver of what companies do, is this answer: who's going to have to pay for the weekly testing? That is the number one question I think we're waiting on for when the ETS comes out. Our insiders who've talked to some of the head guys at OSHA have told us that they will definitively answer this question, and they are trying to figure out which way causes the most people to get vaccinated. So on one hand, they could say the employees have to pay for it. That would obviously drive some people to get vaccinated because they're not going to want to have this weekly cost. On the other hand, for those of you with large unvaccinated populations, if you have to pay for weekly testing for every unvaccinated person for 6 months, for many employers, that is going to be an untenable cost, which will then bump you into the mandatory vaccination crowd. So that is really the big question that we're waiting on to get answered by OSHA when the ETS is issued in all of its details. Who's going to pay for the weekly testing? Also, what kind of testing is going to be required? Are they going to make it be PCR testing, or are they going to allow it to be kind of the instantaneous testing, the at-home testing that is now available? Again, that will be definitively determined, but we believe that the at-home testing will be allowed. On a practical basis, it will be very hard for them to make any other decision. I mean, can you imagine a scenario where if you have to have a new test every 7 days, every employer shows up at their health agency on Friday afternoon to get their testing so they can try and get their test results back before they have to report back to work on Monday? That will cause a system failure. That is unlikely to be what happens. We also know that President Biden is going to allow some level of at-home testing based on what he said in his announcement and on what the White House has put out to date. But again, there are two types of at-home testing right now. One is you swab your own nose and then you mail it off to a lab, so it takes a couple of days to get it back. The other is you swab your nose and is an immediate 15-minute result. Again, from a system standpoint, we are hopeful that they go with the instantaneous result, even if they're not quite as reliable. That from a practical how you make this work standpoint is much more feasible than everybody having to mail off COVID tests every week, because we won't get the results back in time for people to have a negative to actually go back into the workplace. So again, we think those are two of the really, really big questions for the ETS to answer once it's issued. All right, another big question we've had is, if you have a unionized environment, are they going to have to bargain over this? What OSHA has said to date is that depends on your contract. Are there normal health and safety OSHA bargaining obligations? They're not going to interfere with what that looks like. I will also tell you, though, that what we've seen in other states where the union has attempted to bring this kind of COVID safety lawsuit on behalf of their membership is that several courts have said they don't have standing because the safety protocols are individual, and so the individuals have to bring it. So we'll see how that works from a bargaining standpoint. Also, for those of you who occasionally get some union activity here in South Carolina, the unions are very much split on whether they're in favor of this ETS or whether they're opposed to it. But regardless, unions are using COVID protocols selectively to try and gain traction with employers. So just make sure you're keeping your eyes and ears out for that, especially if you're someone who's in an industry that does get targeted by unions. They are using COVID as just an opportunity in general. So another question is about collecting proof of vaccinations and or proof of testing. We do believe that employers will have the obligation to collect that data, and you will need it in case you have an OSHA inspection. So you're going to have some requirement to collect both testing data and vaccination status of your employees. Now, many employers are already collecting this, and we're going to talk at the end. I actually suggest you start looking at who is vaccinated and unvaccinated in your workforce. If you do collect this information, and when you start collecting it, though, you need to treat whether or not someone is vaccinated just like you do other health-related work records, like your workers' comp records, your OSHA records. You have to keep them in a separate file from your HR records, and it needs to be, need to know access only. But again, it's okay to ask someone if they're vaccinated. It's okay to collect a copy of their vaccine card if you want to. But it is going to be important as you evaluate what you're going to do if this ETS stands to know what percentage of your population is vaccinated versus which one is not vaccinated. And again, you're going to have to know this information if the ETS comes out to be able to defend any OSHA inspection or reporting requirements that are put in with the ETS. And we do know that the ETS is planning to have real teeth. It's going to have a $14,000 per violation fine. We don't know if that's going to be like per employee per week or how they're going to divvy out that $14,000 fine. But $14,000 per violation is certainly nothing to sneeze at as far as the teeth surrounding the ETS. So one of the other big questions we have is, well, how is OSHA going to actually manage this? So it certainly will involve more OSHA inspections to go in and actually check your records. We also anticipate that OSHA will request reporting from employers on their compliance with the ETS. Currently, OSHA reporting is voluntary. We'll see whether or not that changes with the ETS, but we do expect there to be more OSHA inspections as a result of the ETS. So now let's talk about, do we think the ETS is going to survive? So will there be challenges to the ETS? That answer is absolutely yes, there will be. The typical way an ETS is challenged, so the ETS is issued, and then anyone withstanding then has 60 days to actually challenge the ETS. Often the challenges come with a request for an injunction, stopping the ETS in its tracks until the lawsuit is resolved. We'll see if that happens. We'll see who decides if they have standing or not. Normally, ETS challenges come by either individual employees, individual businesses, or by business groups. I know we've had a lot of talk at our state level. Usually the states, depending on what they argue, they'll have to be creative to figure out how to have standing. other than as an employer. Maybe they will, but we'll have to see if that happens. I will tell you, yesterday, the state of Arizona actually filed the first lawsuit challenging the ETS. Arizona's challenge is to stop and hold it unconstitutional based on Equal Protection Act. They limit it to the fact that undocumented workers or undocumented persons crossing the border are not mandated to get vaccinated. So they've raised an equal protection argument between US citizens and undocumented workers coming across the border. We'll see if Arizona is successful. I will tell you that OSHA always has what would essentially be that same argument, because OSHA only applies to workers. So there's always a difference in OSHA rules that are applicable to people that work versus the people who are not in the workforce. So we'll see if Arizona is successful. They've taken the first shot across the bow. We are expecting lots of lawsuits to come and challenges once the ETS is issued. So again, at the beginning, I told you this is ETS number 10. ETS number 9 was issued earlier this year. It is a COVID-related safety protocol for healthcare workers and workers in nursing homes. That ETS withstood all challenges. It didn't have a vaccine component, but it did withstand all challenges. Before that one, the most recent ETS was from the 80s. And again, of the 8 that had come out before that, 7 had been challenged and only 1 survived a challenge. So it is a high standard for an ETS to survive. They really have to show that there is a grave danger of harm in the workplace, and that the danger is so grave that we cannot wait for the normal rule-making process to happen. Again, I told you the ETS is only good for 6 months, and then they have to go into formal rulemaking process. Normal OSHA rules take 2, 3, even 7 years. The last one we saw to actually come to fruition. So it is highly unlikely that they'll be able to change this 6-month ETS into a full OSHA rule before the ETS expires if it survives. At the same time, I think all of you should know, I told you the last one they did was a COVID-related ETS for healthcare workers. In a session about 2 weeks ago, OSHA was talking about that ETS, and they went ahead and said that they're going to let it expire, but they are letting it expire because they are already working on a new rule, full rule on respiratory transmissions in the workplace that will cover COVID, but also be broader than COVID. So they're actually already working on the underlying rule that they plan to pass related to COVID in general. So again, what should you expect as this thing is challenged? We're expecting some states to try and pass maybe some legislation to get around the ETS. We're definitely expecting challenges to the ETS. We're expecting people to request injunctions. And then we're gonna have to see how the state OSHAs react to this federal OSHA rule that is passed. So here's some things that I think companies should think about doing right now as you evaluate this thing possibly coming down the pike. So I would strongly suggest that all of you determine the vaccination status of your employees. Knowing how many people are vaccinated in your workforce, I think helps you when the rule comes out, understand what the math looks like for you for the cost of vaccination versus the cost of weekly testing for your unvaccinated workforce for 6 months if the employer has to pay for it. You're going to need to be able to do that math for most of you. Again, that will allow you to do an analysis of the weekly testing costs versus the vaccination costs. Also thinking about doing a labor pool analysis. I know for many of you in the upstate, labor is a real big issue. You can't find enough people to fill your positions now. So, really evaluating maybe with your supervisors, not by individual, but generally, like if we were to go to mandatory vaccination, how many people are we going to lose? Like, do we have a choice about what we're going to do? Or are we going to lose so many people that we don't really have a choice, even if it's going to have a high cost to us? Also, if you are thinking about going the mandatory vaccination route, I really strongly encourage you to sit down with your HR professional and work on a process for your ADA accommodations and your religious accommodations. Mandatory vaccination policies must have an accommodation process for ADA and sincerely held religious beliefs. To be perfectly honest, the ADA requests for an accommodation across the board have been fairly easy to deal with in this setting. It is usually one of a couple of things. It is someone has had COVID within the last 90 days, so they can't get a vaccine until that 90-day period expires. That's an easy one to deal with. It is someone who is in some stage of pregnancy and their doctor has said they cannot get vaccinated during that stage of pregnancy. Someone who has an allergy to the vaccine, or there are a couple of diseases where the vaccine has been problematic. But for most people who have some health condition, the medical profession is actually suggesting they get vaccination. So the number of ADA requests that we've seen across the country has not been very high, and they've been relatively straightforward. What has not been straightforward is accommodation requests for sincerely held religious beliefs. We have seen those come in droves when employers have put in mandatory vaccination policies, and they have been very challenging to deal with. So when you have an accommodation request based on a sincerely held religious belief, the standard for the employee to meet to show that their belief is sincerely held religious belief is relatively low. That's pretty easy for the employee to meet unless it is obviously political or opinion driven. However, the piece I think most employees don't realize is that the standard for undue hardship for employers is also very low under a sincerely held religious belief. So if there is a good reason why you can't make that accommodation because of cost, because of shift scheduling, because of, you can't make it work on your shop floor because of the safety rules around it, that is a very low hurdle for employers to jump over to meet the undue burden on the employer. And thus you do have the ability to let that employee go if you can meet those standards, and it's pretty low for employers. But people are getting a ton of them. So having a process in place is very important to be able to evaluate those claims, and they must be evaluated individually. Also, looking at your current process for tracking testing, for tracking exposure, do you have a process in place that can be scaled up? If you have your whole workforce or a large percentage of it testing weekly, do you have a good process in place for that tracking? Also, identifying who's going to be what I'm going to call your Osha person. Again, for many employers who are going to be hit with this, they do not often deal with OSHA. They're not manufacturing. They don't see OSHA a lot. So really having that person be trained and understand what happens if OSHA knocks at the door. What do you have to do? What do you not have to do? What do you have to give them? What can you say no to? Really understanding the OSHA rules is important, and having one person responsible for being like, okay, OSHA's at the door, talk to me. I know how the company is going to respond and what we can and cannot do is, I think, the other thing to kind of get ready for as we see this ETS coming down the line. All right, I'm going to go through some of the questions. So in states like South Carolina, where testing is available for free, would companies just push this onto the employee to get tested and then prove that they had been testing for the week negative? So in theory that works, but let me tell you where the problems come in. So if you as the employer are mandating the employee go get tested, you should probably be paying for that testing under the current rules if you're mandating the testing. Now, we'll see if the ETS puts that burden on the employee. Again, they may put that burden on the employee affirmatively, which would remove that from the management side equation. The other big problem we see with this approach is it works in theory, but again, it's a volume problem. So what is written in the White House papers that they put out thus far reads as if the employee can't come back to work until they have the negative test every day. and it's going to be a volume problem. Can our testing agencies and facilities really handle this volume of people coming in? And you would assume they'd all come in on a Friday. They don't work Saturday and Sunday to try and get their test results by Monday. Are they going to be able to process enough testing results quickly enough to be able to use the free resources? Again, this is going to be applicable to 80 million people around the country. It's a lot of weekly testing. So, can the free agencies actually handle that? We'll have to see. Would the employee be expected to validate cards? So what we have seen thus far is no, it's kind of the reverse approach to that. So we have some employers who are actually asking for a copy of the card, and we have some employers who are saying, confirm that you've been vaccinated. Please tell me which vaccine you got and the last date of your last shot, only because you need to know that they're fully vaccinated. But where the rubber hits the road with that is if an employee gives you a fake vaccination card, or if an employee lies to you about their vaccination status and then you find out, that would be a lie about health and safety in the workplace, a fraud that should be treated with the severest levels of discipline within a workforce. So there's no standard that we've seen come out on validation. There's really no process for you to do that other than checking the cards. You can't go and check DHEC to see if I've really been vaccinated or if I've given you a fake card. So there will be, we think, some obligation on employers to report if an investigation comes in, or some reporting obligation. So you're going to have to do something to know whether or not people are vaccinated. Would paid time off apply retroactively to employees who are vaccinated sick before the ETS? So that answer is no, we don't expect anything to be retroactive. We expect everything to be forward facing as far as the ETS is concerned. What kind of resources does OSHA have regarding enforcement? So, this is going to be an interesting question. So part of the plan that the White House put out does put in a bunch of extra money for OSHA. OSHA also got a huge budget increase this last year. It is specifically for inspectors. So they're anticipating hiring, I think they have room to hire between 350 and 450 new inspectors. Whether or not they can do that, whether or not they do it, where those inspectors land is anybody's guess. But they have been given the funds to hire additional inspectors for additional enforcement of everything OSHA, not just COVID, but everything OSHA. They've been given the funds for it. Retirees are not included, correct? No, we would not anticipate retirees would be included.
And Ashley, one other question real quick before you get to, I think the last one is actually the last one about, do you work from home until you can come back to the office? That's an interesting question. Actually, before I get to mine.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that question means, do you work from home like after if you go get vaccinated and you're waiting your 2 weeks to come back in? So I think that depends on whether or not you have the ability to do that. If you can't work from home while you're waiting on vaccination, I think you would be required to do the weekly testing until you're fully vaccinated, which for Pfizer or Moderna would be 2 weeks after the second shot. For J&J, it would be 2 weeks after the first shot, of course. But I think until you get to that fully vaccinated period, the ETS is going to expect you to get weekly testing. And that weekly testing will be immediately, as soon as South Carolina OSHA passes. So ETS comes out within 30 days, South Carolina OSHA is supposed to adopt it. Then it's going to be applicable to all South Carolina employers. So that testing would start pretty quickly after this ETS comes out for most employers, unless a lawsuit gets filed and an injunction is granted.
Actually, most of our business investors here with the Greenville Chamber and other local chambers are small businesses, so they probably would be under the 100. Knowing what you know about OSHA and say subcontracting for a major employer, et cetera, because we certainly have a lot of those in town. Knowing what you know about existing OSHA requirements, what do some of those businesses need to keep an eye out for, just in case they get wrapped up with, in this when the final rule comes out?
Yes, so I think that we really need to watch. So first, I would watch what they do on September 24th with the federal contractors, because they have indicated that they are going to more broadly define who is a subcontractor of the federal government to try and include more of them in that role. I think that will be an indicator of what this ETS will do. So again, they have told us they're looking at joint employer relationships, again, subcontractors, your temporary workers, but it's clear the goal of this is to scoop up as many people as they can in the role. I think they're trying to be somewhat careful that they do want it to be enforced. So, the more on the limb they go, the more apt the challenges are to come in, but they're trying to be inclusive. So that's definitely something to watch when the ETS does come out, because they're affirmatively trying to be inclusive.
Would you think that would include the franchisees also? That's another question we've received.
So I think franchisees have a higher likelihood of being included versus subcontractors, because again, subcontractors, it's just a different level down unless you're a federal subcontractor down the line. Franchisees, I think, have a higher chance of being included. And again, they've already said informally on several conference calls that they're going to count by company and try and count as many people as they can to make the highest number of employers be included in this as they can.
The other question we've received are, obviously in this day and age, a lot of businesses rely on 1099 workers and other contract workers. If that pushes you over the 100, do you think they might include that, or how, what do you expect to see when this rule comes out?
Yeah, so we're going to have to see what the ETS is, but we think they're going to try and include those workers again, because they want it to be the most inclusive they can.
Yeah. Any other questions? One in the audience here.
So one other question we got in the chat box is whose swabs will be used, where there'll be kits issued. So there are not going to be any kits issued from the federal government. They have said affirmatively that they're working with at least Walmart, Amazon, and Kroger to make at-home test kits available at costs. We anticipate that cost is going to be somewhere between $10 and maybe $12 per person per week. Again, they haven't given all the details about that, again, about whether it's going to be the 15-minute quick test or whether it's the at-home test that then has to be mailed off. But we do know that they're working on pricing, and we're hopeful that supply will not be an issue. He has budgeted for money for the makers of these tests, and there is funding for them to increase supply. So they're thinking about the supply and demand problem.
Okay.
Again, we don't know who's going to have to pay for the testing yet, which will be obviously critically important to, well, whichever way you are, whether you're an employer or an employee, that's going to be a critical question.
Well, if there's no more questions in the chat, Ashley, thank you. Anything you want to close on? Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns still at this point.
Yeah, no. So what I will say is keep your eyes and ears open. Again, we think we'll get some guidance based on the federal contractor rules that are going to get some more definition on September 24th. But we are anticipating the ETS is going to come out mid-October is what we're guessing, and what OSHA's target is. Definitely listen out for when that comes out. A lot of these questions that we're still waiting on will be defined at that point in time. But again, think about the things you can do to start this analysis, to start planning and preparing, because this will be hugely impactful on your workforce.
Great. Ashley, we will have a recording of this for everyone who may want to go back and watch some of these questions, especially Ashley's action plan. Ashley, if you have any other contact information you want to share with folks who may have additional questions.
Absolutely. You can always call me at Ogletree. My direct dial is 864-240-8302, or my email is just ashley.cutno@Ogletree, and you're welcome to email me or reach out at any time. We have a ton of free resources on our Ogletree website also. We're actually having 2 more detailed nationwide seminars this week. There's another one already planned for the 25th if you're a federal contractor. We're issuing blog posts and really getting out up-to-date information. As soon as anything breaks, we are getting it out to people publicly, free, available really immediately to our clients and our friends in the business community, trying to keep everybody up to date. So I encourage you to go look at our website, because we have lots of free information out there.
Yeah, and Hank just put that in the chat again, ogletree.com. There's a lot of great information there. We've also put some on the Greenville Chamber's blog at greenvillechamber.org, and we will continue to try to update as best we can with information from Ogletree and from the United States Chamber as we hear from them over the next several weeks. So with that, Ashley, thank you very much. Attendees, we appreciate you all taking the time today. Again, recording this will be shared on the Greenville Chamber's website, so we encourage you to go back and look, as well as share it with others as you get a chance. Thank you all again. Let's do our part to care for the community as we move forward here and as COVID continues to spike again. And thank you very much, and we will see you all again at the next Community Matters.
Thanks, guys.